So it is 2. So why don't we slowly get started, and while we wait for the other people to trickle in. Welcome everyone in the Zoom room to the DHAsia webinar. My name is Setsuko Yokoyama, and I'm an assistant professor of digital humanities at Singapore University of Technology and Design. And I'm today's host. As you know, this webinar is organized by a group of scholars doing DH in Asia, including representatives from India, Korea, Hong Kong, Taiwan, Japan, mainland China, and Singapore. So I'd like to thank all the co-organizers who made this series possible. I'm pasting their names in the chat to acknowledge their behind-the-scene contributions. And I'm doing so that if you're interested in the organizing side of things, you can reach out to any one of us at any time. Now, let me introduce today's moderator, Dr. Alastair Gornall, Associate Professor of History and Religion at Singapore University of Technology and Design. Now, he is an expert of the cultural history of Buddhism in South and Southeast Asia. Now, he is also my senpai who leads the DH minor program at SUTD. Now, if you're interested in, or if you are also teaching the at an engineering school in Asia, I recommend his DHQ article for some insights. Because I have a link here, you can take a look. All right. So thank you, Alastair, for agreeing to be the moderator for today's session. Would you mind introducing Miguel for all of us?
Sure, absolutely. And thank you, Setsuko, and hello everyone. Welcome to the DHAsia webinar. So it's a real pleasure to be able to introduce Miguel Escobar Varela, an associate professor of theatre studies at the National University of Singapore. He has a background in web development, translation, and theatre research across diverse cultural contexts. Miguel's research focuses on Indonesian theatre and digital computational humanities, highlighted in particular by his truly remarkable book, Theatre as Data, and various digital research projects. Notable projects include the Contemporary Wayang Archive, Interactive Wayang Screen, Biomechanical Analysis of Javanese Dance, and the Digital Wayang Encyclopedia. Each of these projects integrates technology and traditional performing arts to explore cultural narratives and performance dynamics. His contributions to the DH field have been recognized through awards such as the Wang Gungwu Medal and other accolades in digital theatre and performance scholarship. So his talk today is entitled Computational Methods and Intangible Cultural Heritage. So over to you, Miguel.
Well, thank you very much, Alastair, for that very generous introduction. And thank you, Setsuko, and everyone for arranging this seminar series. I think it's great that we have this virtual space for conversations in different Asian contexts. So that's something that had been missing for a while. So it's a great pleasure to be part of this. And I'm going to be talking about some of the projects that Alastair mentioned, but also some new stuff in here. And my current interest is cultural heritage, and especially intangible cultural heritage. And I will say more about what I'm thinking about that from a theoretical perspective in a moment. But the case study that I will use to think through some of these issues is Wayang Kulit, which is a tradition that I've been studying for some time that I find absolutely fascinating. Some of you might be familiar with this. It's a form of leather puppetry. Sometimes it's translated as shadow puppetry, although the name is slightly misleading. So in a typical Wayang Kulit show in Java, you would see something as what appears on this screen. So here, if you can see my cursor, I don't know if you can actually see my cursor. I hope you should be able to see my cursor here. Well, so you can see a puppet, and you can see the shadow that it casts and on the screen. And then there's actually, you could, in theory, go behind the screen and look at only the shadow side, as it were. But audiences typically see something like what you see here today. So there is, so this is a performer, Dalang, who's the person responsible for narrating the story, for speaking all the character parts. And this is something that goes on for about, like 6-7 hours, sometimes a bit longer. And you would see the audience seated around the performer. Here you also see the orchestra. This is like the gamelan musical accompaniment. And, again, you could kind of, in theory, go behind the screen and see only the shadows, but that's something that people don't do in Java. And they haven't done that for a long time. So one of the oldest illustrations that we have of wayang kulit is from the mid-19th century. And you can see that even in this illustration, you can see the audience sitting around the Dalang. And again, nobody's really seeing from the side of the shadows. And that's different in other parts of Southeast Asia. Even in Indonesia, if you go to Bali, people would see the shadows proper. That's also true in the kind of Kelantan and Patani, like this area in the border between Malaysia and Thailand. And in other parts of South Asia and East Asia, you do have like more shadow puppets. And we don't exactly know why people watch the front, as it were. This is something that has puzzled scholars for a long time, and there's no real good answer. But what's interesting is that, and the reason why it matters to our discussion here today is that wayang kulit is a tradition that has evolved over time, and that is sometimes misunderstood. That sometimes there's a difference between the ways it's described and the actual ways in which it's practiced. And it's a very old form. You can see that the oldest inscription about wayang kulit performances is from the year 908, and it's been more or less constantly performed since then, as far as we know. So it's probably one of the oldest continuously performed traditions anywhere in the world. There are, of course, like very old performing arts traditions in Japan, in South Asia, but something that has like this constant history of continuous performance is pretty rare. And it's still very much used today. So some of the tropes that people use in relation to this is that it's disappearing, that it was more common in the past. But in many ways, it's very much a tradition of the present. And you can see this is a street sign in the city of Yogyakarta. So by the way, Jogja is a reference to Ayodhya, like the city, that's like a similar sounding city, of course, in India, also like Ayutthaya in Thailand. They all kind of refer to the Ramayana, to this story that's sometimes used in the performances. And you can see like a representation of that puppet in the form of a mural in the city of Jogja. So it's part of the popular culture. People are also reinventing the tradition in multiple ways. There's something called contemporary wayang or wayang contemporary, where you would, many artists are reimagining the tradition for newer settings and audiences. Here on the left, you see Petruk, which is one of the most famous clown servants. This is a jester figure. And in this performance here, he's been reimagined and renamed as Patrick. And hipster version of urban dweller version of the same character. You can see some of the features like the long nose and some kind of other stylistic things. So in many ways, it's like still present today. You can see full-length recordings and hip hop and other reimaginations of wayang in these websites. Jing, Contemporary Archive is free and accessible for everyone. So that's kind of just by way of introduction. Some of the people say that the one is that often on the ground as professional practitioners, people who often is here is a dish or that it is like a rural and
Sorry, Miguel. Sorry, Miguel.
Yes.
I think we lost you a little bit, just because the internet is intermittent, and there was a bit of kind of we won't really be able to hear what you said on this slide about the contemporary wayang. So, if you don't mind, would you mind kind of starting again on this slide? and see if hopefully the internet can
Sure.
Sorry about that.
Yeah, no, thanks for that, and apologies for the internet problem. So I was going to say that here, this is that Wayang Pop, you can see it as a recording in the Contemporary Wayang Archive, cwa-web.org. This is a project that we did at NUS, where you can see 25 full-length recordings of contemporary reimaginings of Wayang. But the thing that I wanted to now this is all like table setting so far, but the actual topic of today's session is how we can use computational methods to study a tradition that is changing. And one of the tropes that you often hear in relation to Wayang is that this is a disappearing art. People often tell you, even in Indonesia, that this was more common in the past, and now it's disappearing, that this is primarily like a rural thing. And when people move into the cities, that's not really that common anymore. So that's kind of like a very common thing that you hear. And one of the questions that I've always had is, to what extent is this really a disappearing tradition? And could we find some evidence to settle this one way or the other? And it's hard to find longitudinal data that goes back decades into the past, but we can have more recent data to see, like, what is the, like, even answering the question of, like, how many performances are there in Java? So one project that we did a few years ago was we tracked all mentions to Wayang in social media, primarily like people advertised their performances on Facebook. That's a very common way in which people figure out what performances to watch. And what you see here is a choropleth or a hotspot, an interactive hotspot of performances across Java. And you can see, so like the greater Jakarta region is over here. This area over here is Sunda or West Java, where they speak a different language. The performances are in Javanese, which is the language that is spoken here in Central Java. And there are also, like, sometimes you see some performances in East Java as well. This area here is the special region of Yogyakarta, where I have done most of my fieldwork. This is a Greater Solo, which is like a very famous area for people who study the performing arts. And one thing that you can see is, like, this is, of course, data only that is limited from a few years, but you still see that there's about like 5,000 performances per year. So just think about that for a moment, what that means to have, like, more than 10 performances per day, and on average you have like 1,000 people watching a performance. So that means that just like last night, there were 10,000 people watching these live. So here, like, we have like an excellent attendance today. I have like 30 people watching me speak today, and this is like already kind of quite a lot for an academic audience. But I'm nowhere near competing with the amount of people that watch a Wayang show every day. We're talking about like thousands of people. And this is the absolute baseline. There might be many other other performances that are not captured in social media. This is something that we also verified. So I had like a research assistant that also, together we tried to get a subset of those performances on social media and verify how many of those are correct. We also try to estimate how many of the things we're not capturing. That's a bit harder to do. I can get into that a bit later, but we know that at the very least there are, like 5,000 per year, and that's like, again, like, about 10 per day. And there's like an ebb and flow of the performances, both in time. So sometimes you get to see, like, depending on the ritual calendar, during the fasting month, you see a few less. In August, when it's the independence, and in September, where it's like the beginning of the Islamic New Year, at least in these 3 years, you see a few more. But also, like, it varies over time. So sometimes you see less performances where you're living because they're shifting somewhere else. So this might explain why people have the sense that this is disappearing, but it's kind of constant. It's just that it changes over time, and it changes over place. But so this is kind of one way that we can estimate that. There's we also find like the places with the most performances. And another thing that we are interested in doing is using other kinds of data. So Google Trends data is not often used in the computational humanities, but it's a very common data source for computational social science. Basically, if you go to trends.google.com, you can find data on the things that people are searching for online. So basically, every time that you go and search for something online, that gets recorded. So if you go and search for, like, I don't know, like a top-rated cafe near me, that's kind of and you can see how many people are searching for that over time in different places. So this is data only from Indonesia, in Indonesian, or people searching for Wayang over time. One thing to note is that this data is normalized. So you can see the scale always goes to 0 to 100. So whatever is the highest value would be 100. So you don't actually know what's the scale. I'll get to that in a moment. But you get to see this pattern. And by the way, these patterns, this ebb and flow, also corresponds to that ritual calendar that we saw earlier. Here we see also interesting Wayang over like YouTube search. And again, this is provided for free and you can download the data. But the one issue here, of course, is that people searching for Wayang doesn't necessarily imply that the tradition is alive. It might actually suggest the opposite. Maybe people don't know anything about Wayang and that's why they're searching for it. So we find a search term that will be a better predictor of whether people are actually interested in watching this. So I look for this for like jadwal Wayang. So jadwal means schedule. It's like, you're here looking for the timings as where of like when is Wayang showing. And you can see that interest over this has actually grown over time from 2014 to 2019. That's the period where we collected this data for. And so, people are, so the prediction, of course, the assumption is that if you're looking for the schedule, it's because you want to see the thing. Now, how do we deal with this problem of the magnitude? We don't know what this means. 100, is this like are we talking about 10 people, Are we talking about 100 million? So one thing that you can do here is you can compare it with another search term. So that helps you estimate, like, where are you in terms of the magnitude? So one thing I compared this with Game of Thrones, which, back in the day of, 2018, before the pandemic, it was like a big part of the cultural milieu. Like everyone was talking about Game of Thrones, of course, before they, erased themselves out of our collective memory with that, botched final episode. But, here, one thing that you can see is that over time, the people looking for jadwal Game of Thrones, so the schedule of Game of Thrones, what it's showing, is almost always less than the people looking for the schedule of Wayang. Except, of course, here at the very end, just before the final episode where interest peaked. Also, here we see Jokowi, the president of Indonesia, that he made a reference to Game of Thrones in an ASEAN meeting. And then HBO tweeted this image of him. It says in Indonesia, like winter is coming. And then anyway, so the point here is that, again, we don't know what the magnitude is, but we can argue that, well, actually interest in looking for the schedules of Wayang is more present overall than of this like massive cultural phenomenon of Game of Thrones. So again, this is adding evidence to what we had before of the social media trends over time. And the thing that I'm interested in collecting is YouTube data. So you can actually, using the API of YouTube, you can extract all mentions to a particular term. So here, we extracted all mentions to Wayang videos over time. Actually, we couldn't go before 2014. That's a limitation of YouTube. YouTube is not an archive, of course. It's not meant for historical research. So you cannot access to the API things before 2014. But even then, there are like different ways in which we try to find recordings of Wayang performances that are full-length performances. So these are the things that are happening in Indonesia that are at least 3 hours or longer. So not a snippet, but a full-length recording. And one thing that is very common in Indonesia is that if you go to see a show, it's not only seen by 1,000 people live, but it's live streamed. So like often what happens is that people arrive a bit late to a performance, and on the way there, while you're trying to find the place, you might be watching it already on your phone on YouTube. And maybe you leave a bit earlier, you don't want to stay until like 4 a.m. in the morning, but you watch the end on the way home. And this is the number of Wayang recordings uploaded to YouTube per year. And again, here I'm talking about full-length recordings over time. So this is there are 34,000 Wayang videos. Think about the magnitude of that. I think that's really like remarkable. It's like few traditions would boast those numbers. 114,000 total hours. I calculated that if you did nothing but watch Wayang on YouTube for 8 hours per day, this would take you 150 years. Watch everything that's been produced over the past 5 years. You can see like the median duration here in the solid line. So the kind of the median duration of these videos is about 5 hours. So some are like 8 hours, 9 hours. Some are a bit less, but they tend to increase also over time. Also the total views over time. So there have been like 300 million total views since 2014. One limitation here is that we don't know if it's the same person watching the same video multiple times, or multiple people watching different things. But this is not just people uploading things. It's not like just me uploading my lectures, online and hoping that somebody will watch them. And I'm happy if 10 people watch them. These are millions of views. So arguably, it's a tradition that's still very much alive. And if you look at the comments, they're also fascinating because people can, you often see like the Indonesian diaspora speaking about these performances. So they would say, oh, greetings from Dubai or greetings from wherever. Like, I'm also from this village where this performance is taking place. So that's another source of data that I hope to analyze and mine. But here you can see the viewing statistics. So a median video. So again, I'm not taking the average because the average can be skewed if there's a lot of a famous performance. But again, like the median view is 5,000. I mean, think about that again. I cannot emphasize when people tell me this is disappearing. From 2014 until now, the median video of an 8-hour performance is watched 5,000 times. And this of course increased here in 2019 because of the pandemic. So one interesting thing that happened is that during the pandemic, you could not have performances with spectators, but the performers kept the show, kept the lights on, as it were. So the viewership skyrocketed, and now it's gone back a little bit to its normal levels. There might be some like ebb and flow. We need to see this over time. We intend to keep collecting, but that's still like pretty good news for me to answer that question. Is this disappearing? So we don't know, but at least there's some evidence to suggest that at least in the scope of the past 5 years, the interest in this is constant, and we're talking of a very present part of our cultural setting. To backtrack a little bit on why am I interested in this as cultural heritage, I'm interested in studying heritage as a process. One could, it is a very active tradition that is constantly changing. It's the result of the interactions and decisions of hundreds of thousands of people, artists, sponsors, spectators. And I'm interested in this conceptualization of heritage as process. Some of you might be familiar with the words of David Harvey, this very often repeated quote that, heritage is what people tell each other about their past, about the way they forget, remember, memorialize, and fake. Or Barbara Christian-Gimblett that talks about heritage as a mode of cultural production in the present, which is very close to the past. And Wayang is very much this thing about the past, about like, there are many ways in which, the stories are of, famously people would say, oh, these are like Indian stories. But is that really the case? The stories, you could say that some form of the stories come from South Asia. The Ramayana and the Mahabharata are used in different traditions in that region. But in Java, they have been constantly readapted in multiple ways. You have also the influence of Islam for the past 500 years that have changed it. So, to what extent is this really, like a South Asian story, and to what extent has it been adapted? So this is another common trope that we could also investigate with computational means. So I did this project called the Digital Wayang Encyclopedia. This is a network analysis of characters in Wayang. So I'm just going to play this video. So you can actually go to the website. You can find it from my own website, miguelescobar.com. And here it's a data-driven encyclopedia where you can see all this information on the different characters. The way this worked is that we take a story. So even though the stories are based on, say, the Mahabharata, you will never have the entire Mahabharata presented like even in a slice of 8 hours. You take a simple chunk, and then you have some story, and that story develops over those 8 hours. So I constructed a network, a co-occurrence network, where each character is a node, and 2 characters are connected if they are present in the same scene. So this is a co-occurrence network of scenes, of characters in a scene. And you have like, Bhima and Arjuna present together, there will be like an edge between them. And this, here you can see that at the level of the individual story, but also here's the aggregate of the entire universe of the stories based on a selection, on a sample of these stories that are commonly performed today. And this is, again, like, freely accessible. You can find the data, the code, everything on GitHub. And also you see here the color of the characters. So the ones that are in this, I guess, like pink color are the ones that you also find in the South Asian versions, whereas the ones that you see in green are purely Japanese inventions. So Kresna, or like, we say Kresno in Japanese, you might be familiar with Krishna, like the pronunciations are a bit different. Like, so Rama, like, Ram, Bima, Bim, these are famous in like South Asian region. And one thing that kind of we then ask is, what percentage of the characters are, of Javanese origin? So, take a guess. What do you think? We asked even like experts and people who are familiar with this. And one thing that is surprising is that actually, of these common stories, only about half of the, so people tended to say, oh, only 10% of the characters are Japanese, but it's actually a lot more. It's almost like a equal distribution. So about 50% of the characters are Indian in origin, so like, or finding the, South Asian retellings of the stories like Bima here, and Dewaruchi, this is a purely Japanese invention. So that's about 47% of the characters. Now, when you look at the network metrics, there are lots of different things that you can calculate, and I won't get into detail, but one intuitive metric of the network location of the characters is the degree. The degree is just the number of connections that might be familiar with people in this audience, but just for clarity. So if you have like a character is co-present with 10 other characters, then that character's degree would be 10. And what you can see here is in this visualization over here, this is the degree of the characters that are found in the South Asian versions. And you can see that they are spread out through the entire spectrum of degrees, from those with very low degree to those with very high degree. Whereas the Japanese characters tend to cluster, either like, there's lots and lots of characters that are here towards the bottom, and the clown servants, which are like really important, they're part of many, many stories, that they're towards the top. So then here I answer the question of like, why do people underestimate the number of characters that are present in these stories? Well, the reason is that even though they're equally common, they are integrated into the fabric of the story in a different way. And this is a purely network thing, because if you were to count just number of times that they appear, there's no big difference either. The difference is that the characters that are from the South Asian, that also found in the South Asian versions, tend to appear a lot more often with a lot more characters. So it's not just that their mention is higher, they are a lot more, embedded in this complex fabric of this network of the stories. So in some ways that explains, or at least that's my theory based on these findings, why people underestimate the number of characters that are of Japanese invention. And again, to connect this to what I was saying before, this is interesting because like this is a tradition that is always invented, as any tradition is. It's the way we use the past in the present, and people are constantly adapting. But we don't always have like a good sense of how that's happening. And people often fall back on this trope that, oh, these stories are from India, but not really. They are distinctly Japanese. It's just that the ways in which they're integrated is unique. So kind of like, so our next project that I'm working on is, so for this network, I looked at a sample of stories that are scenario versions. So we call it like balungan, which means like the skeleton. It's like a skeletal blow-by-blow description of the story. So it's like, you have like a one paragraph that tells you what's happening in the scene, and that scene might go on for like an hour. So this is what the performers use to, they're reading it in front of them as they perform. But one thing that would be interesting would be to connect the actual YouTube data, these 30,000 actual performances, and then automatically extract, kind of classify which are the characters and label them. So this is a project that I'm working on. This is, of course, like a much more complicated thing to do because you have multiple versions of the same character. Sometimes the same character, like, Bima. So, for example, you have like Bima is called Huercutoro when he's younger, and he's like this, like the kind of like the ornament is different. There's like longer hair. He only gets this after he goes through this like spiritual trial. You have like variations of the different cities, different regions in Java present the character in a different way. You also have something called Wondo, which is a representation of the character in slightly different spiritual disposition. They're going to battle if they're receiving it. So lots of variations, but we can, in theory, construct this database. We have like a 30,000 images of multiple versions of these puppets that we're using to train a machine learning algorithm to be able to identify these characters in the actual, so segment the Wayangli performances on YouTube and redo the network, but in this case, based on this other source of empirical data. So I'm kind of like, I guess, running out of time, or actually, no, I still have a few more minutes. I think I was given 30 minutes, so I'm going to, so kind of one way in which we can think about these computational methods for cultural heritage is this analysis. So trying to answer questions, and questions that are pretty concrete, like the ones that I walked you through so far. Is this tradition disappearing? Is it primarily a rural phenomenon? Well, that's another thing that I didn't talk about, but by the way, we don't see any correlation between the type, like, people would say, oh, places that are more rural would have more performances. Not true. Or people would say, well, actually, cities would have more performances because they have more of everything. Also not true. There's like, no correlation between some places have more performances because they've had them for a long time. So there doesn't seem to be any impact of population statistics on demographics, whether people are migrating or not, or places becoming more rural, that doesn't affect. So again, the question I had, like, is this disappearing? Evidence suggests it's not. And the other question is, like, what the place that this Japanese invention plays on the puppets, on the stories, and this is kind of one way to answer that from the videos. But those two are examples of questions that are more scientific, perhaps, in nature. The other thing that we can use computational techniques for is for developing new ways of engagement with the tradition. And one thing that I'm really interested in is working with museums and galleries and other kinds of memory institutions to develop interfaces and other kind of digital interventions to help people understand a bit more about this intangible cultural heritage. So here, this is a project that we did at the Art Science Museum in Singapore. We also exhibited this in Indonesia, in Java. Let me see if you are seeing the same thing. I think you're seeing, yeah. So here's a YouTube video. And let me just show you this briefly. So basically, the idea here is that so people would come to this exhibition and they would become the dalang, the performer. So you sit down and you get some instructions on how to use it. And one of the and then by using these like gestural language taken from wayang. So for example, there's a puppet here called the Cayon that you rotate, and rotating means that a new scene is about to begin. So we borrowed that gestural metaphor to say that when you want to see a new video. And then the performer would rotate it and then place it on one side of the bog, which is the banana trunk, and then a new video would show. And then you have like this knocking pattern called like the toktokan that you use to basically the dalang uses that to control the orchestra, to direct the orchestra. And here that's another way to kind of like interact with the videos. But the point here is that you are learning this, like the visitor to the exhibition learns these gestural conventions and learns like a different aspect of the tradition and interacts with these videos in that way. And another project that we're working on now is we have this collection of 30,000 puppets that are at the Yale University Art Gallery. The story is unique. They were collected by a Swiss zoologist who spent his life in Indonesia studying different animals, but his like real passion was for wayang kulit puppets, and he bought boxes and boxes. Often when people collect the images, they would cherry pick and only choose a few specific puppets. But what Walter Axe did was he collected entire boxes, so he could get the entire box, and that would mean that we have this evidence of like entire traditions, like regional versions that have gone have disappeared. And the collection spans from the early 19th century until the 21st century. And these are like 30,000 puppets that have been photographed. But you can see here like a photograph is this like archival grade photograph where you see the kind of the dimensions and these puppets cannot be, it's very hard to exhibit all of them. So one thing that we're working on is we're developing an interface where you have like a augmented reality or some other kind of interface where you're able to actually have like a simulated version of this puppet and that you can control and move around. So the goal is to go from this two-dimensional image to something that can be moved. So that means we're able to identify the joints as the one you see over here and reconstruct part of the puppet, because sometimes, like here, like the arm is covering part of the puppet. So we use generative AI techniques for that, for this. It's called like a de-occlusion. So that means when you have something that is occluded, you want to computationally de-occlude or reconstruct that part of the image and then have this. So that's kind of like, we have like a seed grant at the moment working on this. And this serves two goals. One is we hope people engage with tradition in a more nuanced way, because you get to exhibit thousands of puppets, not just a few. But also, we have like multiple versions of these puppets, multiple poses that then we can use to train our recognizer, so we can classify the characters from the videos. And you know, I'm you know, for the future, I'm interested in talking more with colleagues from around the region and beyond. Also, I'm interested in working with students and expanding this beyond Wayang. So, I mean, Wayang is always what I use as the example, because it's a tradition that I studied for a long time, and it's difficult to gain kind of the linguistic and cultural knowledge of one thing, let alone several. But I'm interested in collaborating with people to expand beyond, to really think about cultural heritage as something that we can study computationally. And yeah, so that's kind of what I wanted to share with you today. Thank you for listening. Just to summary that, we can use like cultural heritage as a process, and that's the theoretical foundation for analyzing it at multiple scales with different methods. I'm by no means saying that we should only use computational techniques. There's enormous value in ethnography and other kinds of ways to probe at these questions at a different scale. But sometimes these larger data sets give us an overview of these questions that matter to the communities that are involved with cultural heritage. And I gave you examples of some data-driven insights that, one is that it's not really a disappearing tradition. And the second data-driven insight is that Javanese and Indian characters are equally common, but differently integrated into the fabric of the oral tradition. And the last idea was that digital interfaces can help us explore cultural heritage in nuanced ways. So yeah, thank you very much. If you're interested in any of these projects, you can also see more in my website.
Thank you, Miguel. That was a fantastic presentation, and your work is really on the kind of computational humanities is really inspiring, in particular kind of the sensitivity with which you come at this the Wayang Kulit tradition using these methods, which I think is wonderful. So now we can turn to questions. So anyone wants to ask a question, you could just raise your electronic hand or your real hand, and I will ask you. So Nian, would you like to ask a question?
Hi, can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Hi, Miguel. It was so nice to see you again, and just a super cool project. Really, really cool. I'm really inspired. I have a lot of thoughts and questions, but let me try and organize them. So for one, yeah, you mentioned Barbara Kirschenbach gimlet, but I'm not sure if you've come across Laura Jane Smith, who talks about heritage as performance and process, and as you and how there's no such thing as tangible heritage. All heritage is intangible. Yeah, and so the way that you have exhibited these objects and this, or the objects of even as videos as objects, makes it very clear, like this interactional and this performative embodied kind of process of experiencing and consuming heritage, which is really, really cool. And then also I'm really interested in I don't know if this is silly, but diachronic analysis of the characters and their use. So you gave, like, in terms of the Indian characters and the Javanese characters, like I wonder if it has changed over time, that set of data, like how it has, whether it has evolved over time. I don't know, because the way, like, this is what I'm most interested in terms of heritage, because as you said, it's all about the past represented in the present, like the relationship to the present, right? So I'm thinking about things like Kutiatan, for example, and its rise, with Hindu nationalism. So like connecting it to contemporary kind of political contexts, whether I don't know, I mean, it's very Javanese art, wayang kulit, for example. So whether there is, whether we can connect it to a sense of Java centrism, and I don't know, like with the move to Kalimantan, whether there's the different ways that we view Javanese heritage. I don't know. So like, yeah, so whether you would be able to do some mapping with contemporary events, or depending on the time period.
Yeah, so yeah, thank you. And yeah, good to see you, Nian, in this digital room. So just to kind of maybe respond briefly to some of the things you mentioned, the Laura James Mead is really interesting. The idea that there's no such thing as annual cultural heritage, because even like a building or a site is always, there's like a process that keeps it alive. And that's another thing that I think is a good opportunity for us in this community to study, because that process leaves a lot of computational traces or digital traces. So for example, I'm interested in the ways people talk about heritage, the ways in which heritage is covered in the news, in different, in pamphlets, in museum guides. So what kind of tropes are repeated? And that's something that we can definitely study, even those who are more interested in things such as the buildings or other kinds of memory sites, as it were. And the other thing about the diachronic thing, that we don't have the span of data for that. So that's something that would be amazing. But you also do what you can with the data that you were able to gather. So if we had, if the data existed for the past 200 years, that would be amazing. But we don't have that. So that's also like, one thing that I guess we're all very aware in this community is that data is always constructed. It's always created by certain people in certain cases. So you don't have you can do what you have with the data that somebody thought of recording. And there's like a million things that, people in generations in the future would say, oh, if only they had recorded these other things as well. And we don't, it's out of our, technological capabilities or even out of our imagination that would be useful. So that's always like we always need to take it with a pinch of salt, as your question reminds us, that we are able to do the things that we can. Lastly, on the political thing, I think that the trick is for computational things to always find a concrete a way to connect the question to something that can be measured. So the example that you said about like how the capital of Indonesia is moving to Kalimantan, that's something that would be, maybe there's a way of saying like, what percentage of the cultural and heritage events in Kalimantan are Japanese? I think it's a really interesting question, like, to see like, are they going to aim for some kind of parity, or is that going to be like some parity at the beginning and then eventually Japanese will take over? Like, what kind of dynamics would we see? And maybe that kind of cold counting of the numbers and the percentages doesn't appeal to everyone, but I would say it's part of the question. And even though many of us are interested in the politics of representation, I think that the trick is how do we connect that those questions to something that is concrete and measurable and representable as data.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you so much.
Great. Anyone else got a question? So while people are thinking of their questions, I can maybe ask one of my own, a kind of very simple, foolish question, just simply very broadly. You spent quite a while talking about this assumption that wayang kulit is disappearing. So I was just wondering, whose assumption is that? Is that the assumption of kind of people who study Java? Is it an outsider's assumption? Is it an assumption of the Javanese themselves? And if I think you've quite impressively shown that it's not disappearing in your analysis. But then the question is, how do we interpret then people's perceptions that it is? So where does that come from? And if it's a self-perception, that's even more interesting. The fact that even though it's flourishing, Javanese may think that it's not. And so what does that say about culture, heritage in the current moment?
Yeah, no, that's interesting. So, like, just the first part of like, where's the assumption? So I hear this all the time, So I would go to, like, if I go to Java and like, I don't know, I take a taxi and then the taxi driver says, oh, what are you doing? Oh, I'm studying this. And people are like, why would you study this? Like, it's disappearing. Unless, you get two extremes. Either somebody saying like, oh, great, I just saw a performance yesterday night, and who's your favorite performer? Or the other extreme saying, oh, this existed when I was a kid, it doesn't exist anymore. And people confidently tell me, it's gone. And you hear these, like even amongst scholars of Indonesia who are not interested in wayang. If you talk to like wayang scholars or people whose life is about it, they know it's extremely alive. And why is it that it's so invisible and yet so present? The kind of the theory that I got from the data is because in part it like moves over time. So like you might think there's less, but it's just like this ebb and flow of like the seasons, the seasonality of the performances, but also the performances move through Java. And often they're in makeshift venues rather than in like larger places where they're like visible. So if you're not connected to that, you don't see them. And I have another slightly crazy idea of something I want to do about finding ways to identify the performance. There's like that from nightlight data that you can see so they kind of remove things like cloud and like lots of other like noise, so you can see like these bursts of light, and you can use that to estimate, say, like economic growth. That's what economists do. But in this case, there's like a marker of a wayang performance because it's in a place that you wouldn't expect it, and there will be like a lot of light for 8 hours at night. So there's like a very clear marker of that. So we can actually use that. That's kind of like what I'm working on now to kind of try to identify where the performances are in a more empirical way. But yeah, I mean, I think that the kind of more simple answer is that because it moves, people don't see it. But your larger point, I think, is fascinating about what does it say about culture. And I think that it also shows us there are lots of things that exist that we are unaware of. I mean, there are probably even quarters of the university that don't know what digital humanities is or what anthropology is, even. Right. So I think that there's like this weird thing that we often assume that we know what's happening. But the reason why, there's like all these kind of cultural practices. Like I see my students do projects on things that I have never heard of. And there's like this whole, for example, like there's like a whole all I think other East Asian knew about this. I was unaware of the hundreds of groups in Singapore that do this. So I think one of the arguments for computational analysis of culture is that culture is so distributed, so participatory, that sometimes our default assumptions what is current might be wrong, and data might offer a corrective and paint a more complex picture of what actually culture is today. So yeah, thank you for that.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. That's really interesting, and I certainly buy into that. I think, generally speaking, we're not necessarily the best people to analyze ourselves, and so sometimes to get some having some external help to kind of some data to kind of contextualize our own thoughts about ourselves is quite an interesting thing. So yeah, that's great. So maybe Ming Lao, I think you have a question.
Hi. Thanks for the amazing talk. This is the first time I hear about wayang, and I just looked at the archive and they all look really amazing. I have a question more about like the things that the performers say during the performance. Like given that it's like just dropped.
Oh, is Miguel gone? Oh, he has.
It is.
Okay, well, maybe let's, Ming Lao, if you just pause your question. I think he's just back. I can see him. He's just reappeared. Let's see if his webcam comes on.
Hello?
Hi.
Are you there,
hear me?
Miguel? Yes, we can.
Yeah, I don't know what happened. I was just suddenly like my Zoom closed and then reopened.
No worries, we've got you. So Ming Lao was just starting a question.
Okay.
Yeah. So
sorry, yeah, I heard that you said what they're saying.
Yeah, and I know that performance, the average performance are hours long, and I wonder if you've looked at the things, the language content of the performance? Like, do they use the same phrases in multiple performance about of the same Lacan, or do they change a lot, like the scripts? Are they like how much like prepared they are, and have you ever looked into like the exact wordings they use in your archive?
Yeah, well, so the archive has these it's like translations and transcripts also. So they are, and we are going to put a new set of performances online soon that are like these long performances. And there's also like a philological study that a researcher in the Netherlands did that looks at the reuse of these sentences. So the Wayang is semi-improvised, but you have lots of these tropes that are reused over and over again. So, you know, how in English you would say something like, you know, once upon a time, so like this set phrase. So Wayang has like, you know, like hundreds, like thousands of these things. And sometimes you have like this set, like this narrative trope that goes for like a whole paragraph.
Oh.
So sometimes, like in a very traditional performance, they are reused exactly. More contemporary versions that are still considered traditional today, they do something called like garapan, which means they try to avoid reusing these tropes. So it will be really interesting to see how that happens at scale. Now, so in the archive, we manually transcribed everything and translated for those 25 short performances that are more contemporary in nature, and for this new set of 7 online performances. What would be great to do is also to computationally transcribe those performances. And that's something that is easy to, so the performances are in Javanese, which is not a language that is, so a combination of Javanese and Indonesian. Indonesian works very well, Javanese not so well. And this is something that also, like, you know, Setsuko can speak about the politics of transcription. How, you know, that like Javanese can be spelled in different ways, like words broken up in different ways. So there are some challenges there, but that's something I'm interested in as well. So even if you don't have like perfect accuracy of the transcription, you could look at a broad level at the question that you alluded to, which is like text reuse, like patterns of text reuse. That would be super interesting to see, you know, are the performances with more spectators more innovative in language, or do they do a lot of these like, you know, set phrases, and has that changed over time? So yeah, like definitely like, you know, things that are fascinating and kind of within reach. So YouTube has like a built-in transcriber that it's a bit hit and miss for Javanese because it assumes everything is Indonesian. So it's not great, but it's actually totally possible to fine tune. And that's I mean, I'm applying for another grant to look at that, to fine tune like a transcription model called a Whisper from OpenAI with Javanese and Wayang specific data. Because like Wayang also has its own literary language. So yeah, we've got I mean, I can yeah, so I can put a link now of so I'll just put it here. So this is the link I have here is a digital version that I did of a book created by a Wayang scholar, a linguist, that looks at these patterns of text in Wayang. So it's not per se, but it looks at how, like, so you have all these phrases, and he would explain, oh, this is very common, this is always used, this is different. And like the actual book is like, you know, 800 pages long, and we have it all like in this free digital format. So yeah, hopefully that'll be of interest. And yeah, thanks for that question.
Thank you. Looks great. Thank you.
Great. So I think we have time for one, maybe two other squeeze questions, but there is one in the chat. So Viola asks, I'm interested to hear you share a bit about the digital Wayang encyclopedia, about how the digital Wayang encyclopedia can be used for pedagogical purposes. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So we are, also, I guess that what the encyclopedia can do is show some structures of the stories. The other thing that it can do is show, maybe I can just open it here. Where is it? Also see, like, you know, so it serves two purposes. One is this, so let me just try to share my screen. Where am I? Okay, here. So yeah, so again, you can click on any of these So the characters here, so let's see it's in Gatot, and you see some information about the character, and you go to the full description. So here you see kind of like a description of the Japanese retellings of the story, but also like the Indian retellings. You can find the stories where the character is found. Here you can see also like the family relationships. So all of this is interlinked. So in some ways, it works as a data-driven encyclopedia. And you can see here the stories. So like icon, like this is like if you click on one, again, this is supposed to be like a 9-hour performance. So you can see this like jejer, like this like first scene, like this would typically take. So it's an hour to expand it. So this is like the skeleton, and then the metaphor is just like you add the flesh with like the music and the dialogue, and it's like a semi-improvised performance. So I think from a pedagogical perspective, that show the types of like how a story is constructed, how the characters are connected to each other, and so we think it can be used in that way as well, in addition to answering these questions as I showed earlier. The more images, it doesn't have images because we don't have. Often when you look at an encyclopedia, the image that you have is the default Surakarta version. You actually have like hundreds of versions of puppet. Can you still hear me? Yeah, okay. So we want to have like a connected to the images, and then even would be that, you know, if you have your phone, you take a photo, like you're watching a performance or whatever, or you encounter a puppet and you take a photo, and it would identify which puppet it is and tell you like the story and show you other similar versions, like variations of that puppet, which is difficult, but it's not, I mean, the challenge there is labeling the data and working through it, but from a technological point of view, it's not impossible. You know, these are things that people do for, you know, if you're interested in like ukiyo-e, like the kind of these like, you know, prints that I'm mispronouncing, but I'm sure you know what I'm talking about, like ukiyo-e prints. There's this product that you can also take a photo and it will tell you like these prints where it's from, or
I think, Miguel, we couldn't quite hear you at the end there. Are you still there? Okay, maybe we've lost Miguel. Well, we are a couple of minutes to the end. So, well, we might just wait and just to say thank you to Miguel to see if he logs back in. If he doesn't, then we can call it a day.
Right.
So we can just hold on.
Mm-hmm.
I did have a follow-up question to that though, but I will save it for in person. But I was wondering, you know, when about the labeling of the data, whether there was any kind of, how do you choose those labels, right, and categories, and do those relate to the actual? Miguel, you're back.
Hello. Yes, I do not know what the issue is, but my internet is a bit.
Yeah, no worries. No worries. Maybe if I could squeeze in one last question before we say thank you and goodbye. I was just very quickly wondering, you know, when you were talking about the labeling of your data, whether you kind of ran into any issues about the categories that you were using. You know, I was looking at the genealogy and stuff, and I've tried to kind of create genealogical maps for like mythological stories, and some of the relationships in these stories are kind of indescribable sometimes using the structures that we currently have and things. Wondering if that was the case with
Absolutely. Yeah, 100%. I mean, that's always the case of like, you know, there's always like this thing that sometimes like, you know, schematic bias, which is how you kind of like, when you design the database, you think of, oh, you know, like we'll have like these columns, but then the actual data of anything, like, you know, doesn't, it's always more complex than whatever thing we have. And this is true for culture, but also for kind of everything. Like, you know, so what we do here is that that's why we also have the descriptions of the stories.
Right.
So the source data for this is encyclopedias. So we look at the encyclopedias and we show the most common version. So you say like this character, like, you know, married this other character, or I don't married is not always the correct, you know, route to the kind of, you know, procreation or the generation of the new character. So that they have these very weird origin stories that, you know, so we do we include a narrative.
Yeah.
So we try. So we still have like these like maps of the genealogy, because that's something that is found in the encyclopedias, and people are interested in that. So we use the more the one where there's more consensus. But we of course acknowledge in the description that there's variation and also unrepresentability.
Right.
But that sometimes, just to give you kind of an example here, like, some character, like, so it's very common that a character kills another character, and then after killing that character, assumes the name of the one that was killed.
Right.
And that character that was killed comes to live in the body of the victor.
Right.
So like, how do you like that doesn't confront to, so, and that's just one example amongst many. So yeah, that's it's a great question also that we should all, I guess that's part and parcel of working with data, that we always need to squeeze the diversity of the things that we study into the limitations of the data bases that we invent for that purpose.
Right. But it's a fun challenge.
Yeah.
So maybe at that point, we can just say thank you, Miguel. Thank you so much for giving a fabulous talk for us. And Setsuko, do you want to say a word about the next webinar at all?
Sure, yes. No, thank you, Miguel, for a wonderful talk. And thank you, Alastair, for accommodating. And thank you, everybody in the room, for wonderful questions. I would like to continue the discussions. And if you haven't already, there's a Discord channel for DHAsia, so feel free to join and find us there. The next webinar is going to be in March. Details are getting worked out, so you will find the announcement going around soonish, so stay tuned. But it's been great seeing all of you. Thank you once again to Miguel, and I'll see you next month. Take care.
Thank you very much. Thank you.